less than 100 days in office,
what is our purpose in Afghanistan?
President Obama has a war to his name.
Coming, man, they're coming!
Level the building.
AFPAC combines, expands, and escalates America's theater of operations in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Pakistan poses a mortal threat.
As the Taliban advance and the Pentagon deploys 30,000 more troops,
it is military suicide.
we ask, who's to blame for the current escalation and what's behind America's surge in Central Asia? This is Empire. Hello and welcome to Empire. I am Marwan Bishara. It's deja vu all over again here in Washington, as the new administration escalates its Afghan war and expands the theater of operation into Pakistan. The establishment and the majority of the public opinion are marching to the drums of war, just as they did on the eve of the 2003 war on Iraq. The enthusiastic military is refreshing its war contingencies. The unquestioning media is cheering, and a complacent Congress moves ahead with its so-called peace bill in support of the new AFPAC strategy. And the pretext, well, it's more of the same, politics of fear. Meanwhile, a surge of new attacks in Iraq demonstrates that the war and occupation there are not over. And come summertime, the Obama administration might be fighting not one, not two, but 3 wars that could push the greater Middle East and indeed the Asian continent towards further instability, chaos, and war. I'll be discussing what's at stake with my studio guests in a moment, but first, Tim Tate describes America's new state of play in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
It was meant to be the good war that America had won.
Our nation has destroyed Afghanistan's terrorist training camps, saved the people from starvation, and freed a country from brutal oppression.
But someone forgot to tell the Taliban. The number of American and NATO soldiers killed in Afghanistan has been rising every year. So what went wrong?
The Taliban were simply routed. They were not defeated, they were routed.
We've been arrogant but mindless about the approach.
Instead of trying to end terrorism, I think they are creating more hatred and they are producing more terrorists in this region.
It didn't have to be this way. In the 1960s, Kabul was a modern and forward-looking city. Today, 30 years of war have left it a pockmarked shell. The Karzai government may rule here, but it controls just 10% of the country. And despite almost $15 billion in international aid, the promises made to ordinary Afghans for a better life are unfulfilled.
Every 30 minutes, an Afghan woman dies in childbirth. 20% of Afghan children die before the age of 5. They don't have access to power, they don't have access to clean water, they don't have access to health care.
Many Afghans are welcoming the return of the Taliban to provide their most basic needs.
What the Taliban are bringing to the Afghan people is security, their #1 priority. And that sort of undermines everything this current government can offer.
President Obama is now sending thousands more US troops into the Afghanistan meat grinder. But the new plan seems less like a repeat of the allegedly successful Iraq surge and more a return to the failed policy of a much earlier imperial war.
Vietnam was about a quarter the size and had 8 times the number of troops that there are in Afghanistan, and they still lost because they couldn't persuade the people that the system of government that they were backing was the right one for them.
You are clear to level the building.
American bombing raids targeted on Taliban leaders have killed at least 7,000 innocent civilians, driving many Afghans into the ranks of the insurgency.
I think that this whole notion of hearts and minds should be taken out of the American lexicon. We'll never win the hearts and minds of the Afghan people, but with the right strategies, we can win their trust and confidence.
To win Afghan trust and confidence, Obama's plan also calls for an increase in the Afghan army, backed by US armed civil defense militias.
The Afghan army might become a better trained force. Militias, I don't think there's a hope.
America's war on terror has not only failed, but it has spread the problem to neighboring Pakistan.
We cannot underscore the seriousness of the existential threat posed to the state of Pakistan by a loosely confederated group of terrorists and others who are seeking the overthrow of the Pakistani state.
The border between Afghanistan and Pakistan is no more than a line on a piece of paper. On the ground, it melts away, allowing Al-Qaeda and the Taliban to move freely between the two countries. And with fellow hardline Islamists now controlling the Swat Valley, the Pakistani government in Islamabad has no control over the entire northwest of its country.
Pakistan is now faced with its own internal Taliban movement, which is even more, in many ways, more threatening and more horrifying even than the Taliban movement in Afghanistan. It is terrifying and intimidating the local population.
But Washington seems determined to shoot itself in the foot by sending unmanned drone aircraft to bomb Taliban and Al-Qaeda targets in the places where the Pakistan government's writ doesn't run.
The consequences are going to be horrendous. The entire nation is going to see this as an invasion of Pakistan. Today you have thousands of freedom fighters or militants. Today you have thousands of them, then you will have hundreds of thousands of them. I think this is a recipe for a great calamity.
Having lost its supply routes through Pakistan, Washington is also courting a new set of dangerous allies, the highly unstable former Soviet states on Afghanistan's northeastern borders. It needs their support to open a new military and civilian supply line, far away from known Taliban-controlled areas. 8 years after the war to liberate Afghanistan, new imperialists are once again playing the 19th century great game, treating Afghanistan as the ground zero in their renewed struggle for regional domination. Russia wants to strengthen its grip on what it sees as its historic backyard. India is using the cover of reconstruction in Afghanistan to destabilize its old enemy, Pakistan. China has invested billions of dollars in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And Iran is exerting influence after decades of assisting the Northern Alliance.
This situation is far more complex than only terrorism kind of a scenario. There are very serious strategic implications of US continuous stay in this region in terms of its influence on Iran, destabilizing Russian and Chinese interests. I am not very sure if they are going to remain silent spectators for very long.
With me to discuss the escalation in Central Asia and the Obama's new strategy, or let's call it Obama's new war in Afghanistan and Pakistan, is Mr. Lakhdar Brahimi, a former special UN envoy to Afghanistan, and Seymour Hersh, a renowned investigative reporter and author who works for the New Yorker magazine, as well as Shuja Nawaz, director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council, and also author of books on Pakistan. And from Montreal, Mr. Tariq Ali, a leading commentator, novelist, and author, among others, of 3 books on Pakistan. Gentlemen, welcome to Empire. Mr. Brahimi, among those who observed Afghanistan over the last few years, you stand out as the outside observer par excellence. How bad is the situation in Afghanistan?
I'm afraid it is very bad, and it has been left to deteriorate consistently. I think everybody made mistakes. Probably the central mistake was to say that Afghanistan was about fighting the so-called global war on terror, whereas we should have concentrated on the fact that Afghanistan had been subjected to all sorts of wars for 30 years, and what was needed was to help the people of Afghanistan rebuild their state. If you rebuild the state in Afghanistan, then there will be no room for international
But of course,
terrorism.
it became a forgotten war for so many years.
It has. It's not. It's worse than that. I think it was a deliberately ignored war. You know, we're saying the Taliban were finished. The Taliban were not there. The Taliban, I think, everybody now recognizes, were routed. They did not surrender to anybody. And then, of course, they reassembled, and now they constitute a formidable force.
Mr. Hersh, we know for sure, everyone does around the world, that Taliban is the enemy of the United States. But why is America, you as someone who's probably reported more about the city than anyone else, why is America going after Karzai all of a sudden?
For a lot of reasons. There's long-standing issues of corruption, lack of leadership, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think also, if you remember, he began talking about wanting to talk to some of the Taliban, some of the more, what we quote unquote, the moderate Taliban.
Yes.
The bottom line for me in this whole issue, we don't have an end game. There's a division inside. Publicly, they talk about victory. Privately, they're very skeptical. And I'm afraid what worries me is we're going to see the classic American pattern, which is going to be more and more force. And the more and more force we make, the more and more people we're going to turn into Taliban.
And Mr. Nawaz, is the situation in Afghanistan, or does the situation of Afghanistan threaten the national security of the United States?
Not the situation of Afghanistan per se. When we went into Afghanistan, we meaning the United States and allies, there was no comprehensive strategy.
Yes.
And now it was only about a year ago that there was even an attempt made to consolidate just the military part. And now there's a plan, but the implementation was missing.
Tariq Ali in Montreal, tell me please, why the expansion of the Taliban's influence in Afghanistan should matter to anyone from Minnesota or Mississippi for that matter?
Well, I think it is fairly predictable what happened, and some of us did predict it. What were the war aims? According to the former president, George W. Bush, the war aims, he simplified them to the level of absurdity, was to capture Osama bin Laden dead or alive, and to capture or kill Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban faction closest to bin Laden. If one judges them on the basis of what he said, it's been a total failure. In the early days, if they had concentrated on reconstruction, rebuilding a country torn by 30 years of continuous war, they might have won some goodwill. But they didn't do that. In fact, they used the only methods they knew, which got worse and worse. Civilian casualties began to mount so that even Karzai got nervous and pleaded with them not to be so undiscriminating. And simultaneously, you enter one of the poorest countries in the world with a paraphernalia of NGOs, air-conditioned tents, corruption on a massive level, massive disparities in wealth between occupier and occupied, and you implant a regime which is totally and completely corrupt.
If I understand correctly, Mr. Brahimi, you disagree with that. I think you think that Karzai is one last important chance for Afghanistan.
I think Karzai started out as a very honest Afghan patriot. I think that he himself has not been accused by anybody of being corrupt. But I'm afraid people around him, and people say that includes his family, are definitely corrupt. But it is silly to have to see this blame game that is taking place now between President Karzai and his allies. That's not the enemy. I think the enemy is somewhere else. What you need is a real strategy. What is it that you want to achieve? If you are running after bin Laden, Afghanistan cannot help you. Bin Laden is not in Afghanistan. Bin Laden left Afghanistan by the end of 2001. Everybody knows that.
Yes.
So you are fighting your war, if that's what you want. You are fighting your war in the wrong place.
But also Pakistan, Sai Hersh, it seems also President Zardari is falling out of grace in Washington. It seems American allies that Mr. Brahimi is talking about are not exactly the favorite candidates today.
I asked somebody high up in the intelligence community why he does everything we ask him to do, and he went like this, you know, money. Because as you know, the Pakistani military is deeply involved in the bombing that's going on. They're not unaware of the Predator bombing and the bombing by drones. They're involved in it. Zardari has let us do what he wants, and at this point still, I will tell you, one of the options on the table, of course, is continuing him. One is getting rid of him, and one is they're even looking at Sharif. They're sort of desperate. They have three options they're talking about, and from a lot of points of view, none of them are really starters.
And here you have it, Mr. Nawaz. It's surely Pakistan's business, no? What to do with a city like Bunar or those northwestern areas. It's not America's business, is it?
Of course not. It is Pakistan's war, but it became America's war from the moment Pakistan agreed to accept reimbursement for sending troops into Fatah.
Yeah.
So once you accept that, then you change the equation and you become an army for hire. And that is why there is so much opposition within the ranks in Pakistan to this arrangement.
Tariq, your last book, the last of a trilogy on Pakistan, is called Dual. It's about Pakistan and the United States. Are you concerned with those who are concerned with the situation in Pakistan and the heat that America is bringing to bear on the country?
Well, I am very concerned because it can only end in disaster. The history of US-Pakistan relations has been a very tormented one. Now, in order to continue and maintain an occupation of a country with 30 million people, they are prepared to destabilize a country with 170 million people. It doesn't make sense. One reason for that is that the army doesn't want to keep sending out its own soldiers to kill its own people, regardless of what their political or religious beliefs may be, because this sort of activity demoralizes an army at its very base. If the Pakistani army were to split as a result of this war in Afghanistan, it would be a disaster. When the footage of Taliban militants flogging a woman was shown on Pakistan television, there was horror and outrage throughout the country. And I think the government should have said, we will do a ceasefire, but we are not going to agree on you running any part of the country. Let's have a referendum. Let the people decide. And the Taliban would have been cornered.
I'd like to add, Tariq, that a referendum of sorts did take place a year ago when there was an election in this area, and the Islamic parties were routed and replaced by the ANP. So the voice of the people was heard, but it's the government which was elected in the province that refuses to heed the voice of the people.
Someone else is not heeding the voices of the people, which is apparently the people in the Obama administration who are coming up with a new strategy for not only Afghanistan, but for what's called the AFPAC strategy. Let's look at what exactly are the main points of this new strategy before we start discussing it.
Today I'm announcing a comprehensive new strategy for Afghanistan and Pakistan. We have a clear and focused goal: to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat Al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan. These soldiers and Marines will take the fight to the Taliban in the south and the east. We will shift the emphasis of our mission to training and increasing the size of Afghan security forces. There are also those who've taken up arms because of coercion or simply for a price. These Afghans must have the option to choose a different course. We will forge a new contact group for Afghanistan and Pakistan that brings together all who should have a stake in the security of the region.
Well,
bye-bye Obama.
Sai, let me ask you something very specific. Do we have now an Obama war?
We're getting there. It's amazing. I will tell you that I do know, despite these words, that there are many people inside who think this war is not winnable.
Why? Why?
Because it's just not winnable. Because the more, General Motors goes to war, the old General Motors goes to war. When we have a combat battle, the next thing you know, airplanes, and we're bombing villages. And every time we do a mission, the collateral damage is so high. So the way we operate is with overwhelming force protection, which means that We'd much rather, I don't blame them, it's totally logical. You want to protect our soldiers, which means you shoot first. And with each new soldier, I had a serious American officer say to me, each soldier will mean one more casualty in Afghanistan and one more member of the Taliban.
Mr. Brahimi.
Nobody thinks that this war can be won militarily. The thing is, what they are trying to do, I believe, is see if they can have what they call a new strategy to avoid defeat and to see how they can end this in a positive manner.
But Mr. Brahimi, they've already started the bombardment through the drones.
Yeah.
And they've already threatened, and they actually made a deal with apparently with the Pakistanis about not sending, for the time being, troops on the ground. So the idea of the war option is not just on the table, it's being implemented in Pakistan.
If there is anybody who thinks they can win this war militarily, I haven't met them. And if there are, I don't think they are right. They cannot win this war.
Let me ask my good friend this.
Yeah.
The president just said we will defeat the Taliban. Is he talking about psychologically?
I think he said he will defeat Al-Qaeda. The Taliban in Afghanistan cannot be defeated. I mean, they can be defeated in 30 years if you can put 200 or 300,000 soldiers on the ground. Yeah, and you stay there 20 or 30 years,
Mr. Nawaz,
you can do that.
you've written that book, Cross Swords, on Pakistan recently, about the nature of life, military, and society in Pakistan. If America couldn't transform a country of 23 million people like Afghanistan, it's going to be able to transform, defeat, win a country like Pakistan of 175 million people?
I don't think that the attempt is to win a war in Pakistan. I think at best the United States should look at Pakistan as a partner and try and help convince them that this is their war.
But I'm sorry, Mr. Nawaz, I'm not going to get you off the hook on this one, because they are using their own drones, their Predator airplanes, with some PlayStation-type machinery out of here, out of Washington, it seems, and bombarding different places within Pakistan.
Absolutely, and this is obviously some kind of a kabuki theater that is going on between the United States and Pakistan, because this is done with the tacit understanding and approval of the Pakistani authorities. So this is not something that is new. It is a pretend game, and it's about time that there was a leveling of this with the Pakistani population if you want to win the Pakistanis over.
But Mr. Yes, go ahead.
If I want to bring you back a little bit, you said the Americans have not been able to transform Afghanistan. I'm afraid they didn't try to transform Afghanistan. They went there for revenge. They went there after the people who attacked them. And they told the Taliban, we are not interested in you, we are not interested in your country. What we didn't know in the United Nations when we went there is that they were already thinking of Iraq. They were not thinking of Afghanistan. They thought, as a matter of fact, they would finish the job in a matter of weeks and then move on to Iraq.
By the way, we're going to get to Iraq in a second, but I want to get Mr. Ali's response on the question of Pakistan. You know, President Zardari said, I'm losing my country. It seems he's being sandwiched between the Taliban on the one hand and the American pressure on the other hand. Just a recent visit by Chief of Staff Mullen and the Special Envoys Holbrooke, certainly putting a lot of pressure on the Pakistanis. What do you see the end game of this in the near future, Ali?
Well, I think that if the United States carries on like this, they will end up defeating what they say is their own purpose, which is stabilizing Pakistan. In fact, they're destabilizing it. You know, the drones business isn't a joke. The figures which have now been revealed is that over the last 2.5 years, the 701 people have been killed, 94% of whom were innocent civilians. And that is a figure which we've got from the country's largest newspaper, which has done a systematic survey. So the United States should be careful. And you know, I was very annoyed watching television the other day to see Ahmed Rashid saying that the Pakistani middle classes now support the necessity of drones. This reminded me very much of Ahmed Chalabi's stuff before the war in Iraq. And I think the United States should have learned one thing, which is not to trust someone whose first name begins with Ahmed and who tells them that everything you're doing is great.
Well, Mr. Ali, we're going to actually be talking right after we come back from the break about the question of Iraq. But gentlemen, we need to take a break.